Obsession can be a very dangerous thing, especially when that obsession is left to grow and fester, and certainly when it centers around a specific person who doesn't share the same feelings. When these feelings are coupled with rejection, well, it's a recipe for disaster in many cases, and it's the innocent party who suffers when one of these obsessions spirals out of control. When we hear that someone has an obsession with another person, we usually think of it as creepy or disturbing. But in the case of 22-year-old Haley Anderson, it all started out very innocently, but ended in disaster. In 2018, Haley Anderson was a student at Binghamton University in New York. She shared an apartment with a few of her fellow students, Josie Arden and Michaela Topali, and everyone in the group was in their final year of college. Haley was studying nursing, and true to her nature, was not only looking forward to finishing college, but had already found a job in Long Island, where she would be part of the emergency department at Northwell Health. Haley's mother described her as being a millennial hippie, who was known to have a great love for music and a friendly and compassionate nature. This, along with her desire to help others, made her chosen career path obvious, and her future looked as bright as she had imagined it. During her studies in the nursing program, she met a fellow student named Orlando Tercero, who was born in Miami and grew up in Nicaragua. And despite their clear differences in upbringing, the pair instantly hit it off. They started dating but didn't take the relationship too seriously at first, and Haley's friends would later state that they broke up and got back together several times, but always remained friends. When Haley wasn't in the midst of studying for an exam or attending classes, she enjoyed hanging out with her roommates, and on the 8th of March of that year, that was exactly what she, Josie, and Michaela were doing. The group had decided to stay up late that night, and they shared a few drinks while they were playing board games in their apartment. At around 4 a.m., they decided to go to bed, and they each headed off to their separate rooms. None of them had any idea that by the following day, their lives would be irrevocably changed forever. Josie made it to her room that night and fell fast asleep fairly quickly. She slept throughout the night without a care in the world, waking up the following morning and deciding to reach out to her roommates after having her morning coffee. She headed over to Haley's room, but immediately noticed that Haley wasn't in her bed, but this wasn't terribly unusual. In fact, most college students would attest to this. Josie decided to send Haley a text to see if she was still willing to attend a poetry reading that night, since Josie would be reading some of her work and she really wanted her friends to be there. But she got no reply. Calls to Haley's cell phone also went unanswered, and as the day went by, her friends started becoming more and more concerned, since Haley was always quick to respond. This was not like her at all. She was also usually very active on her social media accounts, but none of them had seen any activity since the previous day, and this was not a good sign. At the very least, Haley's friends felt that she would have at least notified her roommates about where she was, whether or not she was okay, and whether she'd be meeting them for the poetry reading later on. But they hadn't heard one single word. Her silence was completely out of character, and they started to think that something might be very wrong. Luckily, her roommates remembered that she was using an iPhone, and they could track it via the Find My Friends app. Thankfully, their efforts were successful, and they realized that her phone was on Oak Street, the same street that Orlando, her boyfriend, lived on. This was a perfectly reasonable explanation for why she'd suddenly just up and vanished. She'd spent the night out with her boyfriend and likely just lost track of time. But unbeknownst to Josie and Michaela, the situation was much worse. As it would turn out, the police had already been to Orlando's house earlier that day. His sister had contacted them to report that he'd sent her a very worrying text message earlier that morning, in which he stated that he'd done something bad that would disgrace their family. But he didn't elaborate on what was going on. Since then, he'd fallen completely silent, and she'd been unable to get a hold of him. When Orlando hadn't responded to any of his sister's calls or texts, she asked if the police could stop by his house to make sure that he was okay, as he'd also been acting very strangely. Investigators were happy to oblige and traveled to his house, but when they arrived, they got no answer at the door. The house seemed empty, and since nothing seemed to be out of place and there didn't seem to be any cause for alarm, they left without making contact with him, since they didn't have the immediate cause to enter the building. After all, it was very likely that Orlando just wanted to be left alone, and it's not their place to bother him. When Michaela and Josie arrived at the house later on, nothing had changed. The building seemed quiet as ever, almost as if nobody was home. Interestingly, Orlando's car was not parked in the driveway, but they knew that Haley's phone was inside the house, and so they decided to investigate further. They walked around outside the house and managed to find an open window. Michaela climbed through first, quickly followed by Josie, and they started searching through the house while making their way to the bedroom, assuming that's where Haley's phone would most likely be. As they combed through the house, they quickly confirmed that Orlando was not inside as expected. But it was then that their lives were changed forever. As soon as they entered the bedroom, they saw Haley lying on the bed, partially covered by the sheets. They instantly knew something was very wrong, since she was pale and didn't respond to any of their shouts. The girls didn't immediately understand what was going on, likely because they were in shock. Worried that Haley may have been badly injured or worse, they called 911 and the police were sent back to the house to investigate. When officers arrived, the girls' worst fears were confirmed. Haley had lost her life. It didn't take investigators more than a few minutes to determine that Haley had lost her life after her breathing had been restricted. A local pathologist would later add that someone had done this with their bare hands. The pathologist also noticed a few other strange marks on Haley's neck, but he believed these were caused by the necklace that she'd been wearing. Naturally, the first question on everyone's mind was, where's Orlando? No one had been able to contact him, and he clearly hadn't been home all day. Investigators questioned Haley's roommates and quickly learned of Haley and Orlando's on-again, off-again relationship, which they immediately suspected may have played a part in the crime. Josie and Michaela explained that the couple had never gotten too serious, and that Haley had finally decided to end their relationship for good as her graduation grew closer. She was more than willing to be patient with Orlando while the two were in school, but now that her life was moving on, her wants and needs changed, and Orlando just didn't fit the image of what she pictured her future would be like. But it would then come to light that there was another man in the picture, Haley's ex-boyfriend, Kevin Ocampo. Haley and Kevin had gotten back together in September of 2017 while she and Orlando were taking a break. Orlando found out about this while the three of them were attending a house party, and he didn't react well at all, as he was seen shouting at her at one point during the night. It seems that when they were on a break, Orlando assumed that that just meant they'd be spending time apart, alone. But Haley believed that meant they could see other people. During that exchange, Orlando admitted that he was in love with Haley, and he didn't approve of her dating anyone else. But Haley stood her ground and stated that she just wanted to be friends since she didn't share the same feelings that he did. When the party was over, Haley stayed over at Kevin's place, and this is when the first signs of trouble reared their head. When the couple woke up the next morning, Kevin walked outside and found that Haley's car tires had been slashed. Everyone was certain that Orlando was responsible, since he was clearly very jealous of their relationship. She contacted the police, who then interviewed Orlando, but he maintained his innocence. Haley also knew that since the damage done to her tires totaled more than $600, Orlando would be facing felony charges if he was found to have been responsible. Since she didn't want to ruin his future, she told him that she would hold off from pressing charges if he just agreed to pay for new tires, but there's no word on whether or not he ever agreed to this. As time passed by, it seems as though Kevin and Orlando eventually mended fences and came to terms with one another. In fact, Kevin would eventually ask Orlando to join his fraternity, since they were the only two Spanish-speaking students on campus. But Orlando would lose his place in the group when it came to light that he'd spent a night with Haley while she and Kevin were still dating. Following this, Orlando repeatedly would make Haley feel guilty about what had happened, stating that he wanted to end his own life. While Haley was certainly getting sick of this, she never turned her back on him and continued their relationship. But it was blatantly obvious that Orlando wanted more than she was willing to give. Before long, Orlando started acting obsessively, often driving past the apartment that she shared with Josie and Michaela, even showing up at their door unannounced. It was usually up to Josie to tell him that this was inappropriate behavior and that he needed to leave, but he just didn't get the message, no matter how plainly she laid it out for him. Bringing things back to the crime at hand, just about everyone involved in the investigation was certain that Orlando was responsible for taking Haley's life. But there were still many unanswered questions. For example, why did he leave the house that morning? When did he leave the house that morning? Did Haley go to Orlando's house by herself, or did he pick her up? Luckily, his house was surrounded by surveillance cameras, and investigators managed to find footage showing Haley and Orlando arriving at the house together and walking inside. They noted that Haley seemed to be there willingly, and nothing suspicious came from the footage. The pair then stayed inside the house for a few hours, and eventually Orlando could be seen walking out of the building and clearing trash from the driveway. Following that, he went to a nearby pharmacy and bought a bottle of sleeping medication and melatonin. This was determined after a receipt from the pharmacy was found inside the house. He then went back to his house and remained inside for the next 7 hours, after which he could be seen exiting and walking into the house's basement. This was the first major clue that investigators found. They now decided to head down to the basement to see if any evidence could be found here that may allude to where Orlando had gone. But nothing could prepare them for what they were about to walk into. When the basement was searched, it became clear to detectives that Orlando attempted to end his own life while he was down there. They discovered a set of hooks that had been screwed into a doorway, along with a length of rope, though some sources state that it was in fact a tie, not a rope. Police also found blood on the floor, leading them to believe that Orlando had fallen and injured himself during the attempt. Lastly, investigators discovered a note written in Spanish, which translated to, "I'm really sorry about this. I've never felt I could be capable of doing this. Father, I'll see you soon." Since his father had passed away years earlier, investigators took the note as not only proof that he intended to end his own life, but also a confession to claiming Haley's. There's no telling what must have been going through his mind at this point, since Orlando knew that he would be the first person suspected of the crime. But since his attempt at ending his own life had failed, he must have been desperate to get away, as far away as he could. Security footage then showed him leaving the property for the last time while carrying a suitcase, and his subsequent movements placed him at JFK International Airport, where he boarded a flight, his head still bandaged from the injury. And he escaped to Nicaragua, where he was a dual citizen, hoping police couldn't find him there. But the main problem with this plan is that Nicaragua has an extradition treaty with the United States, meaning that even if he managed to successfully flee to the country, if United States investigators determined him to have been responsible for the crime, he would quickly be arrested and sent right back to the US. At least in theory. There have been instances where the Nicaraguan government has refused to extradite criminals back to the US, and the local district attorney believed that that may ring true in this case. District Attorney Stephen Cornwell stated that when he heard that Orlando had made it out of the country, he was certain he would never face justice for what he had done, since it would be up to the Nicaraguan authorities to decide whether he would be extradited back to the US or not. Since he had dual citizenship, the chances looked bleak. It would later come to light that Orlando's mother met him at the airport when his flight landed, and that they then drove for 3 hours north to her home. Here, he kept a low profile, since he must have known that he was being pursued by police back in New York. While all of this was unfolding, Haley's family was reeling from the news of her passing. And to make matters worse, they had no way of communicating with authorities in Nicaragua, leaving them uncertain as to what could be done to bring Orlando to justice. They didn't know if the police in that country knew that he was being sought in the US, not to mention whether they were even looking to capture him. But unbeknownst to them, news of the case had already made headlines there, and although it never was confirmed, it seems that he then tried to end his own life once again, but was unsuccessful. This is safely assumed because investigators learned that his mother drove him to the hospital 4 days after his arrival, where he received treatment for self-inflicted wounds, though it was never specified exactly what types of wounds he was treated for. Unfortunately for Orlando, this would be the decision that would finally be his undoing. After he arrived at the hospital, someone recognized him from the wanted images that had made their way across the country. Whoever the witness was, they contacted the authorities and reported him. Detectives found him at the hospital, where he was finally taken into custody. Back in the US, Orlando was charged with claiming Haley's life, and all investigators could do was wait and see whether he would be ordered to return so that he could be put on trial. For the next year, authorities from both countries debated whether he should remain in Nicaragua or be returned to the US, and eventually the decision was made for the trial to be held in his home country. And this was not the news that police or Haley's family had been hoping for. And if you ask me, it's just a blatant miscarriage of justice. The crime didn't even take place in Nicaragua, so all of the evidence and details of the investigation would have to be handed down secondhand, and we all know how that goes. This filled Haley's family with dread, since they also learned that the trial would be held without a jury, and that one single judge would have to decide what fate would be appropriate for Orlando's actions. To make matters worse, Orlando wasn't even charged with second-degree homicide, but instead faced a charge of femicide, which is considered to be a hate crime in Nicaragua. Orlando wouldn't even be asked to enter a plea, and this makes it very clear why Haley's family had their reservations about the process that would be followed. During the trial, the prosecution leaned heavily on the fact that Orlando had shown obsessive behavior towards Haley, and that those who knew her the most were well aware of this fact. Her friends reiterated that while Haley had entered the house willingly, showing that she trusted him, Orlando betrayed that trust by ending her life, possibly while she was asleep. They further claimed that Orlando's obsession had been festering for as much as 6 months when he was told by Haley that she didn't want a serious relationship and that she'd gotten back together with Kevin. But this news just didn't click with Orlando. He was determined to either get Haley back or take her out of the picture for good. The theory that the court was operating under was that Orlando had brought up the idea of reigniting their relationship once more on the morning that Haley lost her life. It's assumed she turned him down one final time, and that's when he decided to end her life. Haley's friends were allowed to testify via live teleconferencing, and they reiterated Orlando's obsessive behavior in the months leading up to the crime. They revealed that he would sometimes be found sitting on their porch without being invited, that he was responsible for slashing Haley's tires, and they would often call the apartment to ask for her, even when he'd been repeatedly asked to stop. In the courtroom, the judge also watched the surveillance footage from outside Orlando's house, showing him entering with Haley and then leaving on several occasions while she was still inside. Evidence of his attempt to end his own life was also heard. The pathologist who worked on Haley's case was also called to testify. He confirmed the cause of Haley's passing as manual strangulation, and the prosecution reiterated that Haley had her life taken from her by a man who couldn't accept the fact that she'd made a decision that he didn't agree with, and that it was his obsessive nature that drove him to commit such a despicable crime, which was unforgivable in their eyes. There was no doubt by this point that Orlando was the one who carried out the crime, and hence his defense team decided to build their case around the fact that he'd been drinking the night before he and Haley met up, a desperate attempt to clear his name. They claimed that he had no memory of the events that took place that night, and that due to his excessive drinking earlier that night, he'd gone, quote, temporarily insane when she rejected him, causing him to lose his temper and attack her out of jealousy. This was very obviously a last resort effort to at least have Orlando declared legally insane at the time of the crime, hoping to lessen his sentence or have the case thrown out entirely. In stark contrast to the prosecution, the defense only brought one witness to the trial, a psychiatrist who examined Orlando after he was arrested. He stated that when he questioned Orlando about what had happened, Orlando couldn't give any details of the crime, as he claimed that he'd been very intoxicated and couldn't remember what he had done. He claimed that he could only remember waking up the following morning and realizing that Haley was no longer alive. When asked what Orlando's state of mind would have been when carrying out the crime, the psychiatrist stated that he couldn't say, but added that there was nothing out of the ordinary about his state of mind when he interviewed him after the fact. His defense team also stated that Orlando wasn't known to be a violent individual, and that there was the possibility that he only carried out the crime after he was provoked, though they had no evidence to prove this theory. Once both sides had been heard, the judge left the courtroom for 90 minutes, after which she returned with a verdict: guilty. While delivering the verdict, the judge stated that Orlando was clearly incapable of accepting Haley's decision, and that she felt that Orlando wanted to punish Haley for rejecting him yet again. He was found guilty of the charge of femicide, and she found that the maximum sentence of 30 years behind bars was appropriate. During the sentencing, she stated that all women have the right to life, and that these types of crimes against them should be met with the harshest possible consequences. So Orlando was destined to be sent away for 30 years. The case was unprecedented, since Nicaragua and the US had never worked together in this manner before, with law enforcement agencies collaborating from across borders to bring justice to a woman whose incredibly promising life had been ended by a man who just couldn't take no for an answer. When all was said and done, Haley's family stated that they were satisfied with the outcome, since they were expecting the trial to end very differently, but they were satisfied that the judge had made the right decision. It's often the case in these kinds of trials that something akin to a show trial is put on, all for the sake of publicity. And criminals are allowed to walk free after the fact. But Orlando was now set to pay for his actions accordingly. But Orlando wouldn't accept this verdict either. This man genuinely could not accept anything that went against his own way of thinking. He decided to appeal his conviction, despite the insurmountable amount of evidence against him, and his defense team later decided they wanted a different psychiatrist to evaluate him. In the end, his appeals for a new psychiatric evaluation and for a reduced sentence were both rejected, and he was told that he would have to make peace with the 30-year sentence that had originally been handed down. With all this said, it's unlikely Orlando will ever return to the US, since he still has an outstanding warrant for his arrest, regardless of the fact that he would have already done his time overseas. This decision brought huge relief to Haley's family, who stated that they'd never seen any remorse from her killer, other than the regret that he showed at the fact that he'd been caught. The thing is, Haley had ambitions to make a difference in the lives of others, and this opportunity was taken from her by someone who only had their own best interest at heart. But her legacy has endured in the lives of those that she touched while she was still alive. Haley's mother, Karen, has stated that she's now on a mission to bring as much awareness as possible to crimes of femicide, and one of Haley's friends, Melanie Henney, is now a volunteer at an organization called RAIN, which deals with crimes that have been committed against women in the US, most often by the hands of the men in their lives. She stated that even if she saves just one woman from ending up in a situation like Haley's, she'll be satisfied. It's a sentiment that should be commonplace, but the sad reality is that many women suffer at the hands of jealous partners on a daily basis, and a large portion of them never make it out. They're subjected to fear, assault, manipulation, and in the worst cases, have their lives stolen from them by people who just don't understand that each of our decisions is our own to make, regardless of anyone else's viewpoints on the matter. Unfortunately, it's impossible to predict when obsession will turn into something even more sinister. But what we can do is ensure that the women in our lives, and men for that matter, have a solid support system provided by the ones they love, and that their fears and complaints are not only heard, but acted upon when necessary. Unfortunately, though, it's impossible to govern someone else's life, and the decisions they make at the end of the day remain their own. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of True Crime Stories. If you like this video, check out this other interesting case I covered, and don't forget to subscribe. It's totally free and keeps you up to date with all of my future uploads. You can also click that join button below if you want to see new videos long before everyone else does and help support the channel. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.